All right, guys and girls, this is Jerningham here. Ukraine's Turkish President discusses reasons, tensions with Russia. Will Turkey get involved? Will Germany get involved? Will the UK get involved? Even though Ukraine's going to be involved in the UK. Let's see what it says now.
Ukraine's president has met with his Turkish counterpart on Saturday to discuss heightened tensions with Russia. Ukraine is voicing concern about the increase of Russian troops along its eastern border. Officials say it could mean Moscow is getting ready to send forces into the country. But Russia argues its actions are not a threat, saying it can deploy troops wherever it wants within Russian borders. Western leaders are calling on Russia to back off. The U.S. says Russia has built up more troops on the border than at any other time since 2014.
Rome, Ukraine, Russia, Belgium.
When Russia took a territory from Ukraine and backed rebels
Greece,
in the region.
Turkey, Black Sea.
On Friday, Turkey announced that the U.S. is sending 2 warships through the Turkish Straits to the Black Sea next week. To talk more about this, former CIA Chief of Russian Operations, Steve Hall, joins us now. Steve, thank you for being here. So help us understand, what does all of this mean for peace in Eastern Europe, and how concerned should we be, given that this is a fairly unstable part of the world?
Yeah, it has been unstable over the past, certainly a couple of years, largely because of Vladimir Putin's decisions in that regard. I mean, I think you have to remember that living with Russia, living with Vladimir Putin is sort of like having a big bully on your block who, undertakes all sorts of inappropriate activities and then claims it's being, pushed around and, wants to call in the police, and all of a sudden the rule of law is important. You have to remember that, Russia, annexed Crimea, the first time really since World War II that, countries in the European theater of operations have started annexing pieces of each other. That's extremely bad behavior on the international front, not to mention meddling in American and European elections, wars in Georgia, helping the situation in Belarus, in other words, putting down government protests there. So Russia is really acting inappropriately as a bad actor on the geopolitical stage, and this is, a sort of an increase in that, a pressure that Russia is now exacerbating vis-a-vis Ukraine.
Wow.
When people say, "What do you design for?" I always
Bloody
say,
adverts.
I design for the woman in charge.
There is so much to unpack there, just in what you said, Steve. Let's talk about Ukraine a little bit more, because this is Russia's largest troop movement to the border in 7 years. What needs to happen to de-escalate things, and why might Russia be putting their forces there right now?
Well, Russia's in a new situation. They now have a sort of a professional government back in the United States, one that is, I think, more capable vis-a-vis Russia. And so Vladimir Putin is worried about that. And when Vladimir Putin gets worried about different things, then he'll start to take actions that he deems necessary. For example, concentrate
Russian President Vladimir Putin
with Ukraine to make the point to the United States and to the West that, look, we could make this really ugly if we want to. The Biden administration, in turn, and I would argue this is true for the Western alliances, NATO included, are sort of in a difficult position because they have some choices to make. Do they let Russia essentially declare sort of a sphere of influence in places like Ukraine, historically very important to Russia, and sort of look the other way with regard to annexing Crimea, which was part of Ukraine? Do they look the other way about that behavior that we talked about earlier, whether it's annexing other countries or killing opposition figures both inside of Russia and outside? Do we basically say, yeah, okay, we'll look the other way and let you guys kind of set up your own sphere of influence? Or do we take a hard line, the West, and say, look, your behavior has been entirely unacceptable. The only way to stop you from additional bad behavior is to come down hard on you. Of course, that risks conflict, armed conflict potentially with Russia. So it's a really, really difficult set of decisions that the United States, the Biden administration, and our Western allies have to take a hard look at vis-a-vis Russia.
Well, I want to follow up with the point that you're making about sphere of influence and shift it away from Ukraine and talk a little bit about Turkey's relationship with both Russia and the United States. In the past few years, it has shifted. The NATO ally began moving further away from the U.S. and closer to Russia in many instances. How is that coming into play here? And talk to us about why this is so important.
Well, Turkey is an extremely interesting, perhaps the most interesting of the NATO partners. It certainly has sort of a different profile than our other European allies, and sometimes our interests seem to diverge. But you have to remember that, of course, Turkey's relationship, its bilateral relationship with Russia, not vis-a-vis NATO, but its direct relationship with Russia, has also been troubled. It wasn't too many years ago when the Turks actually shot down a Russian warplane going into Syria, I believe. And that, brought in some initial iciness, but then they kind of got over their differences. And I think Russia views Turkey as a key component of its plan against NATO, which is not so much necessarily a military plan, but one where Russia can work to increase divisions inside the NATO alliance. And Turkey is certainly a good opportunity to do that. Some might argue that Germany in the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is also another opportunity for Russia to try to divide. So Russia understands it's in a difficult position militarily vis-a-vis NATO. It's probably outmatched, almost certainly outmatched. And yet there's other things that they can do on the soft power side of things to try to divide and weaken NATO itself.
Let's go back to another point that you were making, Steve, about the tensions between the United States and Russia, and some of the things that you pointed out, including the cyber hacking, including Russian interference in U.S. elections. All of this coming into the background as the Biden administration is deploying warships into the Black Sea. What kind of message is the new administration trying to send to Putin?
Well, the Biden administration, I think, has done an excellent job about being very firm and very consistent so far with regard to Russia. I mean, the president said that Putin is a killer, which is accurate. All you have
That's
to do
Joe Biden.
And do a little bit of research on all the folks that he
Joe Biden, that is, yeah.
Security
America,
services
USA.
kill, whether they're dissidents or journalists or others. So he is indeed a killer. He's putting his money where his mouth is. He's sending warships into the Black Sea. That's pretty carefully monitored by international treaties, but he is doing it, and he's doing it. I think the United States and our allies are also taking other measures that Vladimir Putin can only interpret as a more aggressive, more assertive stance. And while some might argue that increases the likelihood of some sort of conflict, I would argue that this is simply the United States and our allies speaking the language that Putin understands best, which is one of simple power. Yes, we're going to show you military forces. Yes, we're going to draw red lines. Yes, we're going to hopefully make you understand the forces that you're dealing with, which in turn can then make diplomatic and sort of quieter discussions with the Russians actually more fruitful, I would hope.
From hard power to soft power, I want to shift gears and talk about one of Vladimir Putin's harshest critics, Alexei Navalny. He's been on a hunger strike since last week. His imprisonment has sparked international protests. This week, the Biden administration said it is disturbed by reports of Navalny's deteriorating health. How is what's happening with Navalny affecting not only the relationship between the United States and Russia, but perceptions within Russia of Vladimir Putin's leadership?
Yeah, the situation with Alexei Navalny is extremely interesting. I mean, it's also dramatic and sort of heart-wrenching too, just from a personal perspective. I mean, this is a guy who Putin took so seriously in terms of his anti-corruption exposure that Navalny was involved in terms of what the Kremlin, and specifically what Vladimir Putin had been up to with ill-gotten gains. Putin saw it as such a threat that he actually tried to kill Navalny using chemical weapons. Yet Navalny goes to Germany, recuperates, and then decides to return to Russia, where he had to have known, as did his wife and family, had to have known that the state was going to take grave action against him. And of course they did. And now he's in very serious, as you alluded to, very serious health conditions. It's the dictator's dilemma from Putin's perspective. Do you, I think, slowly murder him? I think that was a phrase used in a Washington Post editorial this morning, by putting him in a tuberculosis-ridden Russian jail and sort of let the Russian system take him that way slowly. Is it more of an execution style thing, like happened to Boris Nemtsov, who was shot not too many years ago right in front of the Kremlin? Or do you let him come out from jail and then risk having him bring the hundreds of thousands of people into the streets of Moscow in protest, like he's done in the past? So it's really difficult from the U.S. perspective. Really, the Americans, I don't think our government has any alternative, but of course to condemn the brutality of the actions of Putin's regime. But by the same token, it gets back to that bigger geopolitical issue. If the issue is a geopolitical one between NATO and Russia, how do we treat Navalny and yet further our own geopolitical interests at the same time. So it's a very, very complicated chessboard that both sides are operating on.
It
Wow.
is interesting to see that three-dimensional chess taking place, and such an important topic to particularly keep our eye on as those chess pieces move. Steve Hall, thank you.
Well, guys and girls, I hope you all enjoyed that. Give it a like, give it a comment, and share it with your friends. And I'll see you next video. Thank you for joining me. Peace.